Hello and welcome to the first episode of Dust War Journals. This is a podcast all about the miniatures war game Dust 1947 and all of its variants. My name is Johannes Haglund, also known on the internet as Frankie, and I'll be your host for this podcast. Some of you might wonder, what is Dust 1947? Well, like I said, it's a miniatures war game from Dust Studio, and it's set in an alternate 1947, where World War II did not end, and it's still going on. And of course, there's also a bit of sci-fi involved with some alien technology, which has led to a lot of rapid technological advances. For instance, laser weapons and Tesla weapons and phaser weapons and walkers and a lots of other fun stuff. It's basically a game with very many different facets. All of them are very interesting and very fascinating and very unique. Before I get any further, I should explain some of the terms I will be using, especially for those of you who are veterans in the Dust world. Because this version of the game that we're using right now, that is current, Dust 1947, has some big changes going into it. First of all, the name itself. It used to be called Dust Tactics, and there was also Dust Battlefield, and there was Dust Warfare, and I'm going to explain all these terms and how they correspond to what we're going to talk about today with 1947. Dust 1947, that's the new system, that's the current one that me and I think very many other people are using at this moment. It involves redone rules, it involves redone stat cards for almost all units in the game, and it can be played in two different variations. One is based on grids and the other is more free form and flowing. In the old versions, the grid-based system was called Dust Tactics. That was the main game. Then in version 2 of the game, they added what they then called Dust Tactics Battlefield, which uses most of the same rules from Dust Tactics, but transformed them in order to support playing without grids. Today in Dust 1947, both of these playstyles are supported by the current rulebook, but the name of the game is the same for both of them. So both are called Dust 1947. And to keep things separated, for the purposes of this podcast, I'm going to talk about the grid game or the grid-based game when I talk about what's used to be called Dust Tactics, and I will call the gridless version Freeform. That's the one that used to be known as Dust Battlefield. There's also Dust Warfare, which is a very different set of rules and stats, and that version is much more similar to other kinds of board games like Warhammer, for instance. Personally, I don't play Dust Warfare. I have never done so. That doesn't mean I don't like it or like the concept of it. I just never had the opportunity. So I'm probably not the best person to talk about Dust Warfare, so I probably won't until I get a chance to actually play it. But there are other places on the internet that you can find info for Dust Warfare. One such place is the very nice podcast Dingoes in the Dust, which I recommend you check out if you're a fan of Dust Warfare. So, let's talk about some news for Dust 1947, and we have some really big ones right now because just a few days ago, as I'm recording this, all of the new Dust 1947 stat cards have been released in a preview version on the official Facebook page. So this is not the finished version of these cards. There are definitely some errors and some things still to be tweaked on them, but most of the things are there, so you can see and what the changes are, and you can play with them and see what they've done. And this has caused a huge amount of discussions on the Facebook page and on various forums, and definitely I think in local play groups. Definitely ours has been a buzz with discussion about these new cards. And there are very many things to say about them. But I will have to tell you, I'm going to wait with my opinion, my thoughts about these cards until I've had a chance to actually play with them and see how all the changes work together. Because it's one thing to look at a card and just compare point for point with other cards. It's a whole different thing indeed to play with the cards and see how everything works in conjunction with everything else. So I'm not going to go too much in depth about the cards in this episode. However, next episode of this podcast will be very much talk about the new cards, all the new changes, all the new stats, all that good stuff. But I will share some thoughts. One thing that's been very interesting to see is the opinion that other people have voiced on the Facebook page and so on about these changes, because it seems to me, at least, that the Dust Studio, the makers of the game, really have listened to what people have said and what they've thought about for at least some points. I know there are other that people argue about. But overall, because in the old version, Dust Tactics version 2, the main consensus seemed to be that the Axis block was overpowered, that they were too powerful in comparison to the other two blocks. The Allied blocks was the one that most people felt was the most balanced, that were the kind of baseline, and the SSU block was weaker than the other two, and by a big margin for some people. And that's very interesting to keep in mind when you look at the changes on these new Dust 1947 cards, because it looks, at least to me, like the Axis block, which people have, like I said, had the opinion that they were overpowered, they have got the least amount of changes, and the least amount of really big changes, at least from what we've seen. And that's very interesting, because that to me says that the Dust Studio does not think that the Allies were the baseline. They think the Axis are the baseline. That's what's kind of the standard strength of the cards, of the units, and of the stats. So the other two factions would have to compensate for that, and that's exactly what we've seen. Most Allied cards have been improved slightly. Either they've been redone, the point costs have gone down, other such stuff. It's not very big changes, but overall it seems that the Allied block as a whole has gotten slightly better. The Axis overall has either stayed the same or gotten very slightly worse. And then we get to the big thing, which is the SSU block, which people had the opinion before that they were a bit underpowered compared to the other two blocks, and they have received some enormous improvements in these cards. And it will be incredibly exciting to see how this translates on the game boards, on the actual tournament results, things like that. And this is definitely a very exciting time for the game. And like I said, I'm not going to talking much more detail about this and my opinions about the changes overall. But like I said, I will be talking a lot about that in the next episode of the podcast. And that's where the next section of this podcast comes in, which I've chosen to call Community Questions. That's where you, the players and listeners, are welcome to come in with your opinions and your thoughts. And the community question for this episode is, what is your opinion on the new rules and the cards and how they work together? I'm very interested to know what you think. So send me all your thoughts and ideas. And there's very many different ways to contact the podcast. You can email at dustwarjournals@gmail.com. You can send a message on Facebook or on Twitter. That's also Dust War Journals. Just search for that and you'll find the podcast, and you can send email, or you can even record a voice message with your smartphone and email that. And if it's short and to the point and interesting, then maybe I'll play it in the next episode. Next section is going to talk about tournaments, and we have a lot of big upcoming tournaments in the coming months. First off, it's the Dust Off in Telford, England. It's going to be held in the 15th and 16th of October. And that's, as far as I've understood it, it's mostly focused on freeform gaming. but there's also going to be some grid-based, but the main focus is on freeform. I'm not going personally, unfortunately, but there are at least some people from my local playgroup in Sweden, the Dust Vikings, which I think some people may have heard about, are going to go to this event, so hopefully we'll get some first-hand kind of experience and some war stories from that tournament, maybe even in the next episode, depending on when that will be released. Then in November we have the European Masters in Belgium, 12th and 13th of November. And that's a tournament that I personally will be going to, so you can expect to hear, probably at least, some audio clips directly from that tournament in the November episode. Then we go to next year, 2017, and we have the Dust World Expo in Arizona, USA. That's 25th of February. I don't have that many details about the Dust World Expo because, well, I don't live in America and it will cost me way too much to go there. But I'm definitely welcome to anyone that will be going there to send in audio clips, send in tournament reports. And last but not least in this list, we have the Nordic Championship, which will be held here where I am in Gothenburg, Sweden, on Easter weekend 2017. That's between the 14th and 16th of April 2017. And that's going to be organized by me and my friends here at the Swedish Dust Vikings group. And we will hope to see as many of you international listeners there, and that will be focused mostly on grid, but we'll probably be playing some freeform as well. Finally, for this first episode, we're going to talk about some hobby tips. This is another section where I definitely welcome you to get your input. I definitely want to link to your YouTube videos showing some aspect of the hobby. For this first episode, I'm going to point you to a video that I've made about how to magnetize your dust walkers. Specifically in that video, it's KV47. That's very timely, I think, now, because the KVs have gotten big improvements with the new cards. So maybe you're going to be interested in how to easily swap weapons for your KVs, and that's basically what that video is all about. And you'll find a link to that video on the Facebook page or on the main WordPress page, that dustwarjournals.wordpress.com. And that said, it's time for me to sign off, and I thank you so much for listening to this first episode of Dust War Journals. My plan is at this moment to release at least one episode per month, and I definitely welcome your suggestions. You have lots of ways to get in contact with the show. You can send email at dustwarjournals@gmail.com. You can find me on Facebook, on Twitter, or on Instagram as Dust War Journals. And until then, I will see you on the battlefield.